Today I'm going to be watching this video and it's looking at differences between Australia and the United States. I've watched a couple of videos like this before and I think it's always an interesting comparison. I've actually watched this girl's first part of this quite a while ago, but so looking forward to the second part, seeing any other differences. You can tell me what you think about these, and yeah, tell me what you think the biggest difference between Australia and the United States is.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to a part 2 of the differences between Australia and the US. I'm specifically going to be comparing Melbourne, Australia to the Bay Area in California, as I just moved from California over to Australia about 2 months ago, so I've noticed a bunch of differences and I wanted to share with you guys what those differences are. If you're interested in seeing more differences, definitely hop over to part 1 as I jump into some different differences that I didn't mention in this video. Of course it's Australia because all the birds are going crazy outside. Alright, now let's jump into those differences. One big difference that I noticed pretty recently was I went into the city. I have a video about it, and in that video I think I really noticed when we're in the city that when I would look up I could see all the stars even though we were in the city. Australia just has so much less light pollution than the US because, well, in terms of like the entire country, there's like, I don't know, I think about like 5 big cities, but in the US there's hundreds and hundreds of big cities. So because of that, the light pollution is really spread out. Like if you look at a map of light pollution from the US, it's super heavy on the East Coast, and then there's kind of a gap, and then on the West Coast as well there's like a big group of light pollution, where in Australia I feel like the light pollution is just focused in these little pockets, but even though it's focused in those pockets, there really wasn't that much light pollution. I don't know whether it's like the design of the lights or just how many people live in Australia compared to the US, but it was so crazy looking up in the middle of the city surrounded by all these giant tall buildings and seeing stars, which is what I'm not used to being in the Bay Area. Now some more differences.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. I've never heard anybody mention that on anything like this before, comparing these countries or comparing Australia to any other country. That is a problem for a lot of big cities. Me myself, I've lived for the last like decade in Asia, Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, Shanghai, and the light pollution, just pollution in general, is an absolute disgrace. I've not seen stars for a long time. Is that the case? Are Australian cities, is it very low light pollution, low pollution in general? Can you see the stars? I think that's something maybe a lot of people might take for granted. It is such a nice thing to walk out at night and have that view. Here in Malaysia, it's just looks like yellow sometimes, the sky at night. It's just disgusting.
Is about the whole car situation. I think most people know that in Australia you drive on the left side of the road compared to in America you drive on the right. And because of that, the driver's side seat is also on the opposite side. Another thing when driving too that I didn't even realize was illegal in Australia is driving barefoot. Because in America, I feel like whenever I'd wear like flip-flops, or Australians call them thongs, but whenever I'm wearing like some kind of sandal and maybe like, or I'm going to the beach or I'm going to the pool, I just won't wear shoes when I drive. I remember my dad saying something about it because he grew up in Australia, and he was saying like,
oh, you're not allowed to drive barefoot, like that's legal.
Turns out it's only illegal in Australia. So in Australia as well, cars always have rights.
Yeah, tell me about that. Is that actually illegal? Because it's like quite interesting how so many people do walk about barefoot. I feel like I don't really know of many other countries where people walk about like the middle of cities or towns barefoot compared to Australia, from what I've learned. But it being illegal to actually drive, I guess it just makes sense that it's a lot safer just to wear shoes and things like that as well. Is that really a law? What's the sort of punishment for driving without shoes? I wonder how you would even get caught for that sort of thing as well. Yeah, cool.
Right of way, unless you're in a pedestrian crosswalk. When it comes to crosswalks as well, you have to stand there and wait to make sure that the car is going to stop, and then when you walk across, you have to say thank you. It is huge in Australia that you have to like throw up a hand or a wave and just be like, oh, thank you for stopping for me, even though you're supposed to. Otherwise, you're a dick. In California, I think you can just kind of walk whatever, nobody really cares about a pedestrian, because also just pedestrians have right of way in a lot of situations, but like in parking lots and anytime you need to cross, most of the time a car is going to stop for you in California. I mean, maybe not everywhere, but most of the time they're going to try and stop for you, and the pedestrians have the right of way. In Australia, like when you're walking in a parking lot, you really have to be paying attention to where the cars are, because the cars aren't going to stop. Like they're not thinking about, oh, I have to watch out for the pedestrians. If they're walking across, I have to stop for them. they're just driving. In California, pedestrians have right of way, right? So if you're walking in a parking lot, you can walk right out behind a car and they have to stop for you. For anybody from America visiting Australia, definitely understand that cars have right of way over pedestrians. Don't get hit.
Don't get hit. That is an interesting one as well, but because I have a specific story about being in Australia that was actually very impressive. Like, me and my wife were standing at a road, no crossing or anything, it was just a little residential street road. We were just going to cross, but there was a car coming. I mean, there was no reason for this car to stop. The car like was driving and it just stopped in the middle of the road, and the guy said, oh, like, cross. We were so impressed, we were so happy. Living in Malaysia again, people are just crazy on the road here. Even at zebra crossings, they don't stop and let you cross. This guy just stopped his car for not having any real need to and let us cross. We were like, this is really like a utopia, man. So my experience of Australia is like, people are super friendly, and even what she's saying about saying thank you to people for stopping. Like, I now get my son, he's only like 4 years old, anytime we cross the road at a zebra crossing and they do let us stop, I'll always make him say thank you. I think it's just a nice thing to do.
Something that I also think is really cool about Australian crosswalks is that when you're going to go like click that button before you cross the street, like where there's lights and stuff, in Australia they have like little beeping sounds. Some places in California have them, but it's not really standard across all the crosswalks. But when you press that button, there's like a slow beep on your side and a beep on the other side of the road where you're crossing to. So it's like, so because of that, you're able to judge the distance of how far it is, and it's really for blind people who are unable to, you know, see the distance, but they can hear the sounds of it and know how far away it is. Also, because they can't see like the little green walking man, because then when it turns green, it starts going really fast. It goes letting you know to go and walk across the road. So in California they do have that, but the sound in Australia is so unique that I think it was like in Billie Eilish's song, where I think one of her family members was like traveling in Australia, recorded like the beeping sound and then sent it to her as a sample, and they used it in one of her songs. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, that one, I did watch a video on my channel like recently that said that Australian crosswalk buttons are the best in the world. And actually, when you think about the functionality, the engineering that went into it, in my opinion, it is. I don't know of any better. I don't really have any more real in-depth knowledge of crosswalk buttons anywhere else, but the one I watched, it makes sense of why it's the best. Like, that one is like, has so many functions to help people. It's a really great thing. And yeah, as you mentioned, it was a Billie Eilish song, but I think it also actually won a Grammy, that song. So it's actually a successful crosswalk button.
About when it comes to cars too, is that in California, every time you would see a stop sign, in Australia you would have a roundabout instead. With stop signs, it's whoever gets to the stop sign first will then go across the intersection. I know there's roundabouts in both countries, but there's just so many more roundabouts in Australia, and I feel like the flow of them is a lot better. You don't necessarily have to wait and be the first one there. It's just if it's clear ahead, you would go. So because of that, I think there is more movement throughout the intersection. And because in California, like, real estate is very expensive, I can understand why they just want like the best thing to work in the least amount of real estate and the least amount of land. The one downside about roundabouts though is that I feel like you really have to be paying attention when you're going through a roundabout. I feel like the stop sign is a little bit more like dummy proof for that. It just kind of takes away the flow from driving though, because with roundabouts, most of the time, if it's not a busy day, you don't have to be worrying about like stopping. You're slowing down and you're yielding, but you don't have to come to a complete stop before going forward. I think it's a little bit more efficient for roundabouts. I think sometimes roundabouts can really work, but then sometimes in the city there will be roundabouts that have lights as well, which I think confuses me so much when I'm driving, because for some of them you would stop in the roundabout and there's lights in the roundabout, and it just drives me crazy when I'm driving in the cities. Okay, so we've talked enough about cars. Let's go into some other differences between the two countries. One thing I found was really funny in Australia is that when you get packages, if you're not there to actually pick up the package, and this could be like shoes or like camera batteries or anything else that I've shipped, most of the time you have to be at the door and you have to be home in order to take the package in. Otherwise they leave a note on your door and you have to go to the post office to pick it up. Occasionally
that's the same in the UK as well, actually,
because maybe you have like a very important package. You have to signify that you're there to take the package. The downside of that too is anytime you need to go to the post office, there's normally like a giant line going out of the post office.
Can it be left at your neighbour's house or anything?
Difference that I noticed as well about Australia is that when you're hanging up something like, say, a poster or a piece of paper somewhere, you use this thing called blue tack instead of tape. Like, let's say we're hanging up a poster. In California, I would take a piece of tape, roll it into kind of like a circle, and then stick that on the wall and stick the poster on it. But in Australia, you have like this, you would buy this ball of like blue tack, which is kind of like this like blue sticky putty. Grab a little piece of it and you would stick that on the wall and then put the poster on top of it. I don't really have a preference to either blue tack or tape, but I just thought it was interesting that in America, most of the time, we're not using blue tack, we just use tape. And in Australia, you use blue tack. I don't know. Little cultural differences that I've picked up on.
That's actually quite interesting. I've not actually thought about blue tack for quite a few years. When I did live in the UK, that's all we used. I've really not thought about it as a method of sticking things to the wall. I don't think it's very common here in Malaysia. We just use that double-sided tape, but that sometimes can damage the wall and things. But blue tack's actually a very good idea. But yeah, it's quite interesting to hear someone talk about blue tack for the first time and it be such a like surprising alien thing when it was so like common when I used it in the UK. But yeah, never not thought about it for a long time. Is it still commonly used in Australia?
I'm going to talk a little bit about restaurants. Most people know that in Australia there isn't really a tipping culture, but in California and in America it's very heavy on the tipping culture. So coming to Australia, it was like a breeze because I didn't have to think about tipping. Also, all of the taxes included in the price, and I'm just not thinking about like, oh, I have to bring a little bit extra money if I'm buying a meal for $20. In California, I'd be like, okay, $20, but plus tax, plus I have to tip, it might end up being like $23 or $24 and some odd cents. The great thing in Australia is like, if I'm going to buy something for $20, I just need to bring $20. I don't have to think about tax, I don't have to think about tip. Another key part of that too is that in California, it's like this new wave of restaurants. When you're tipping before you've even had the service. So it's a little bit frustrating sometimes in California because say you're going up and you're buying an ice cream, they flip the little iPad around and they're like, what do you want to tip? 15, 20, 25%? And it's like, I'm just getting an ice cream. The tipping culture is a little bit annoying. I understand why it's there though, and it's because the workers aren't getting the pay that they should be getting and they're relying on tips for that extra money. It can be a little sad sometimes as well, knowing that you're supporting that person's job by tipping. You want to tip, you want to help them out, but at the same time, it shouldn't be up to you. It should be up to the employer, making sure that they're pricing everything right in order to pay their workers a decent wage. A little story time too. I was in Utah with my mom and we went out to like a Brazilian steakhouse, and one of the girls that was working there said that she said her wage was something maybe like $3 an hour or $4 an hour, like something insane. I know like Utah has a lower minimum wage, but like it was well below the minimum wage. And the reason being is that they included tips in their wage. So they expect them to get, you know, some odd number of money in their tips and to use that as part of their wage. What if one week the tips aren't as good, or you're just not getting paid that much because you're getting technically only like $3 or $4 an hour? So I don't know, it makes me mad and I don't want to spend more time talking about this, but I love that Australia doesn't have a tipping culture. I love it so much. Thank you, Australia. Another difference too that I noticed is that when you're washing your clothes, even though people will have a perfectly fine dryer that completely works and it's not a problem, not an issue, people prefer to dry their clothes outside or like on a line, or what's the word for them? I think it's a drying rack, but when I think of a drying rack, I think of dishes. Anyways, it's a clothes drying rack. So when you're washing your clothes, you're gonna be drying them on like the drying rack rather than like throwing them in the dryer. I don't really know the reason behind it, but it is really good for the environment because you're not using a dryer and you're not using electricity. You're literally using the sun, so that's great, free energy. All it takes is like a little bit of time to like hang up your clothes. So if you don't care about that, totally fine, just dry your clothes on the line. I don't know whether it comes from like European influence as well, because I know in Europe a lot of the time they just don't have dryers, or they prefer to dry their clothes on the line. But yeah, I think it's kind of cool because I feel a little bit like a grandma in Europe, like throwing my clothes on the line, like over the alleyway in Italy or something. And a lot of people have their like these giant drying lines like built into their house, and a lot of houses just come with it. One difference too,
you can also use that for drinking games, I've learned in Australia, but I don't know if that did come from like the UK influence. That's all people use in the UK generally, is like drying like washing lines in the garden and all that sort of thing as well. Yeah, as you said, I think it's just better for the clothes. You don't put them in the dryer, they don't spoil so quickly, and also you can just save money. You don't have to pay to use the dryer in these times of like crazy utility bill costs and
Well,
stuff.
obviously, it's like a huge difference between Australia and America is that the accents obviously are different, but also just like the little things about the accent as well. For example, like a lot of things are just shortened in Australia, and I'm gonna do a whole video about slang. Afternoon, arvo. If someone's like a bricklayer, you call them a brickie. Like, it's all these longer words are just shortened in Australia. California specifically,
Efficient.
I always get outed for saying like a lot, and you've probably noticed throughout this whole video that I just throw in like. I don't know, there's just little things about the different accents and like the different things that we come from our culture that we just do little quirky things. I'm sorry if it bugs you, but it's just how I speak. Sorry, not sorry. Also, if you're looking for other videos around moving to Australia and my experience with moving, I recently got reached out to from a website where they interviewed me and they wrote an article on my experience, so definitely head over to their website and check that out. Alright, the sun is coming out for the end of this video, but I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for watching and supporting my channel.
Yeah, I'll leave a link to her video in the description, so go follow her. Like, I think that's the second video I've seen from her, and it's very interesting. She's got some good points, and again, things like this, she was picking up on things I've not seen in any other videos there. Even things like the roundabouts, like I feel like that's a very British thing as well. We have so many roundabouts. The town I grew up in, East Kilbride it's called, has I think 160 roundabouts. It's a town of about 100,000 people. No, I mean, there's no real need to have that many, but it does kind of work in a way. But it's not, even the people there complain about it being too much. Didn't know that was a thing in Australia. But yeah, tell me what you think about these, and tell me if there's any other interesting differences. Thanks.